There are moments in historical investigation when documentation fails us, when the careful records that form the backbone of human memory simply cease. In the autumn of 1924, census worker Margaret Holloway encountered such a moment. What began as routine administrative work in the rural districts of Millbrook, Connecticut, would become the first thread in unraveling a family mystery that challenges our fundamental understanding of duty, devotion, and the terrible weight of inherited obligation. The discrepancy was numerical at first. According to municipal records, the Bracken estate housed 17 residents as of the 1920 census. 4 years later, Margaret found only silence. The Tudor manor that had dominated the landscape for over 2 centuries stood empty, its windows reflecting nothing but autumn sky, its chimneys cold against the October air. The extensive gardens showed signs of careful abandonment, not the chaos of sudden departure, but the methodical surrender of a space no longer needed. Margaret's trained eye catalogued the details, mail accumulated in neat piles by the front entrance, sorted by an unseen hand before delivery ceased. The brass fixtures bore the patina of months without polish, yet showed no signs of weather damage. Most telling were the curtains, drawn closed from within, their fabric undisturbed by the settling that would accompany true abandonment. This was not desertion. This was conclusion. The reaction of neighboring families revealed the first glimpse of something more complex than simple disappearance. When Margaret knocked on doors throughout the surrounding countryside, she encountered what she would later describe in her official report as systematic amnesia, a pattern of forgetting so uniform it could only have been deliberate. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, whose dairy farm shared a boundary with the Bracken property, claimed no key knowledge of her neighbor's whereabouts. This might have been unremarkable, except that postal records showed regular correspondence between the families spanning 3 decades. The local merchant, Samuel Morton, insisted he had never served Bracken customers, despite ledger entries documenting weekly deliveries through June of that year. Even more disturbing, the parish registry at St. Mark's Episcopal showed gaps where Bracken family entries had been carefully removed, not torn out in haste, but excised with surgical precision, leaving only the faintest impressions on surrounding pages. This orchestrated forgetting extended beyond individual memory into institutional record-keeping. Town clerk Harrison Webb discovered that property tax records for the Bracken estate contained unexplained gaps. The county medical examiner's files showed missing pages corresponding to dates when Bracken family members would have required official documentation. Even the local newspaper's archives revealed careful editing, columns cut out, leaving precise rectangular absences in otherwise complete editions. Margaret's investigation revealed that the last confirmed sighting of any Bracken family member occurred on the evening of June 21, 1924, the summer solstice. Multiple witnesses reported unusual activity at the estate that night. Lights burning in every window until dawn, sounds that might have been singing or chanting carried on the still air, and a procession of figures moving between the main house and the family cemetery. By morning, all activity had ceased. The physical evidence suggested preparation rather than panic. Personal belongings remained in their proper places. Financial accounts showed no unusual activity. The family's prized library remained intact, its volumes carefully shelved and catalogued. In the dining room, 17 place settings had been arranged on the mahogany table, each position marked with a handwritten card bearing a family member's name. The cards remained in perfect condition, as if the meal they anticipated had concluded only hours before Margaret's arrival. Most significantly, pinned to the interior of the front door, was a document that would prove central to understanding what had transpired. Written on heavy paper bearing the Bracken family seal, it contained a simple message. The arrangement is complete. The debt is paid. Let no one disturb what has been willingly given. Below this statement were 17 signatures, every member of the household including the children, their names inscribed in what appeared to be a formal ceremony of consensus. The document was witnessed by 3 individuals whose signatures Margaret recognized as belonging to prominent local citizens: the bank president, the county sheriff, and the rector of St. Mark's. Yet when she attempted to interview these men, each denied any knowledge of the Bracken family or their affairs. Their signatures on the document became another element in the pattern of systematic forgetting that surrounded the family's disappearance. As Margaret compiled her final report, she noted a detail that would haunt her for the remainder of her life. The census record she had been sent to verify contained an annotation in the margin beside the Bracken entry, "Arrangement pending completion, final enumeration to follow." The notation was dated 6 months before her visit, suggesting that whatever had happened to the family had been anticipated, aided, and perhaps officially sanctioned by parties unknown. The community's silence was not random but orchestrated, bound by agreements that transcended individual memory and extended into official documentation. Someone had ensured that the Bracken family would be erased not just from life, but from the historical record itself, leaving only traces visible to those who knew exactly where to look. This systematic erasure suggested that the family's disappearance had been neither sudden nor secret, but rather the culmination of a process that had involved extensive planning and community cooperation. The silence that greeted Margaret's investigation was not the product of ignorance, but of deliberate complicity in an arrangement that served purposes she could not yet comprehend. Yet to understand the nature of that arrangement, we must examine the physical space where it was implemented, a house that had been systematically transformed from a symbol of prosperity into something far more ominous. The Bracken Manor stands today much as Margaret Holloway found it in 1924, a monument to systematic isolation and deliberate withdrawal from the natural world. To understand what happened within its walls during those final months, we must first examine how the building itself was transformed from a welcoming family home into an instrument of the family's darkest purposes. The original structure, completed in 1698, had been designed to announce prosperity and encourage connection. Wide windows invited natural light into spacious rooms. Multiple entrances allowed for the easy flow of visitors and commerce. The architecture spoke of confidence, a family comfortable with observation, eager to display their success and ready to welcome the community into their domestic sphere. But beginning in 1890, a series of renovations began transforming this open, welcoming space into something entirely different. Construction records preserved in the Millbrook Historical Society reveal the systematic nature of these changes, each phase drawing the family further from the outside world and deeper into an architecture of concealment. The first modifications seemed practical, even reasonable. Windows were reduced in size and fitted with heavy shutters that could be closed against winter weather. The main entrance was reconfigured with an additional set of doors, creating what the family described as protection against drafts. Additional walls were constructed within existing rooms, subdividing the generous spaces into smaller, more intimate chambers. These changes might have been attributed to aging occupants' desire for comfort and privacy, were it not for what came next. By 1900, the modifications had taken on a more troubling character. Remaining windows were fitted with heavy curtains that could block all exterior light. Interior walls were reinforced with unusual thickness, packed with materials that local contractors recognized as sound dampening. The grand staircase that had once provided easy access between floors was rebuilt with multiple landings and turns, creating a maze-like passage that obscured sightlines and muffled sound transmission. Thomas Whitmore, whose grandfather supervised the later renovations, preserved family records that detail the most disturbing phases of construction. Beginning in 1920, the family commissioned what they termed contemplation chambers in the basement. Small, windowless rooms accessible only through narrow passages that wound beneath the main structure. These spaces were fitted with reinforced doors, minimal ventilation, and what contractors were told were meditation furnishings. The true purpose of these chambers became clearer when we examined the specifications provided by the family. Each room was precisely sized to accommodate a single occupant in a reclining position. The walls were fitted with subtle restraints disguised as decorative elements. Most tellingly, each chamber was equipped with a small speaking tube that connected to a central monitoring station in the basement's main room, allowing conversations to be heard or instructions to be given without opening the chamber doors. Perhaps most disturbing was the installation of an elaborate pulley system that connected these basement chambers to the main living areas. This mechanism, concealed within the walls and operated by a series of carefully balanced counterweights, could transport objects, or potentially people, between floors without using the traditional stairways. The system was designed with remarkable precision, capable of moving significant weight while operating almost silently. The family's final renovation phase involved the removal of all mirrors from the house. Workers were instructed to seal over the spaces where mirrors had hung, creating smooth, unbroken wall surfaces that reflected nothing. When questioned about this unusual request, Ezekiel Bracken, the family patriarch, explained only that the arrangement requires us to see what is essential, not what we wish to see. Concurrent with these structural changes, the family implemented modifications to their daily routines that mirrored the house's increasing isolation. Deliveries were redirected to a service entrance that could be accessed without approaching the main building. Communication with the outside world was channeled through a single family member who served as intermediary for all external contact. Most significantly, the family instituted what they called silent hours, extended periods when no conversation was permitted within this year's house, creating an atmosphere of perpetual meditation and introspection. The cumulative effect of these modifications was the transformation of a family home into something resembling a monastery, a prison, or perhaps a carefully constructed stage for a performance whose nature remained hidden. By 1924, the Bracken Manor had become a place designed for concealment and control, where every architectural element served to isolate the inhabitants from external influence while facilitating whatever private rituals they were preparing to conduct. Local craftsmen who worked on these final renovations reported an atmosphere that grew increasingly oppressive with each modification. Workers found themselves speaking in whispers without being asked to do so. The temperature within the house seemed to drop noticeably as construction progressed, despite adequate heating systems. Most unsettling, several workers reported the sensation of being watched while they labored, though no family members were visible. The house had become a participant in the family's isolation, its modified architecture creating an environment where normal social interactions became impossible and where the boundaries between interior and exterior, private and public, living and dead had been systematically obscured. The building itself had been transformed into an instrument of the family's final purpose, whatever that purpose might prove to be. To understand that purpose, we must examine not just the physical space the family had created, but the bloodline they had carefully preserved and modified across generations of deliberate isolation. The Bracken family tree, when reconstructed from surviving records, reveals a pattern of deliberate genetic isolation that extends across 2 centuries of systematic intermarriage and bloodline concentration. What begins as practical economics, the common practice of marrying within extended family networks to preserve wealth and social status, evolves into something far more disturbing. A breeding program designed to concentrate specific traits while eliminating others, pursued with scientific precision unusual for its era. Dr. Helena Morrison, the genealogist who spent decades studying New England family patterns, discovered that the Brackens had maintained breeding records with the methodical detail typically reserved for livestock management. These documents, preserved in the family's private papers, tracked genetic characteristics across generations with an attention to hereditary patterns that suggested goals extending beyond simple wealth preservation. The systematic nature of their approach becomes apparent when we examine marriage patterns within the family. Beginning in the mid-1800s, unions outside the extended Bracken network became increasingly rare. By 1875, such marriages were actively discouraged through financial pressure and social ostracism. After 1900, they were forbidden entirely by formal family covenant, with violators facing complete disinheritance and exile from the household. This genetic concentration produced predictable results. Town physician Dr. James Hartwell, whose practice served the family from 1880 through 1920, maintained detailed medical records that document the progressive effects of systematic inbreeding. His notes, preserved in the Connecticut State Medical Archives, reveal a pattern of developmental abnormalities, cognitive impairments, and behavioral disorders that intensified with each generation. Yet rather than viewing these manifestations as genetic disasters requiring medical intervention, the Bracken family interpreted them through an entirely different lens. Family correspondence reveals their belief that physical abnormalities were sacred marks, indicating spiritual sensitivity. Mental instabilities were understood as evidence of enhanced receptivity to communication with deceased relatives. What modern medicine would recognize as symptoms of genetic degradation, the Brackens celebrated as signs of spiritual evolution. This reinterpretation of genetic damage as spiritual advancement became central to the family's breeding philosophy. Children who displayed severe developmental delays were designated as vessels, individuals whose compromised mental capacity made them ideal conduits for ancestral communication. Those who exhibited behavioral disorders were classified as guardians, family members whose heightened emotional states enabled them to better serve the needs of deceased relatives. The family's breeding records reveal the systematic implementation of this philosophy through what they termed the vessel selection process. Beginning in 1875, children were categorized from birth according to specific criteria that the family had developed through generations of observation and documentation. Physical abnormalities, cognitive limitations, and behavioral patterns were all evaluated according to their potential contribution to the family's spiritual practices. This categorization process was formalized through elaborate ceremonies conducted on each child's 7th birthday. During these rituals, the child's role within the family structure was officially determined and announced to the household. Those designated as vessels were immediately separated from normal family activities and began intensive preparation for their eventual function as communication channels with the dead. Guardian candidates received different training, focused on developing the emotional sensitivity and psychological resilience necessary for managing the family's spiritual obligations. By 1920, 2 centuries of systematic inbreeding had produced a final generation that represented the logical conclusion of the family's breeding program. Medical records suggest that several of the youngest family members suffered from conditions that would have been fatal without constant care, yet they were maintained through elaborate treatment regimens that the family justified as necessary for completing their spiritual development. The 17 individuals who comprised the family's final generation were the products of increasingly close genetic relationships, cousins marrying cousins, with some unions representing the convergence of bloodlines that had been separated for only 2 or 3 generations. The result was a collection of individuals whose physical and mental conditions made traditional social interaction impossible, yet whose genetic concentration had achieved exactly what the family had spent 2 centuries pursuing. Dr. Morrison's analysis reveals that the Bracken breeding program had created a population that was biologically unsustainable. The genetic damage accumulated through generations of inbreeding had reached a point where reproduction was becoming increasingly difficult, and the offspring who were produced required such intensive care that their survival depended entirely on the dedication of their relatives. This biological dead end was not an unintended consequence of the family's spiritual practices. It was their goal. The family had systematically bred themselves toward extinction, creating a bloodline so genetically compromised that continuation through traditional reproduction had become impossible. Their final ritual was not an aberration but the logical conclusion of a program that had always intended to end in sacrifice rather than continuation. The genealogical evidence suggests that the Brackens had transformed their family tree into an elaborate funeral pyre, with each generation adding genetic material that would eventually burn away, leaving only the spiritual essence they believed would endure beyond physical existence. Their systematic isolation had created a population that could survive only through the complete dedication of its members to mutual care and service, a biological expression of the spiritual philosophy that would ultimately consume them. To understand how that philosophy developed and why it demanded such ultimate sacrifice, we must examine the doctrine that guided their breeding program and shaped their understanding of family obligation. Hidden within the Bracken family's private archives lies a document that illuminates the philosophical foundation underlying their systematic isolation and ultimate self-destruction. The Inheritance Codex, as they titled it, outlines a comprehensive belief system that transformed traditional concepts of family obligation into something far more demanding and dangerous, a doctrine that would eventually require the sacrifice of the living to serve the needs of the dead. The doctrine begins with a premise that, while unusual, might be found in various forms across many cultures. Death does not sever family bonds but intensifies them. The deceased, according to Bracken philosophy, continue to exist in a state of active need, requiring care, attention, and service from their living relatives. This care cannot be delegated to religious authorities or satisfied through conventional memorial practices. It demands direct, personal sacrifice from blood relatives, creating an ever-expanding web of obligation that grows more complex with each generation. Where the Bracken interpretation diverges from traditional ancestor veneration is in its systematic elaboration of these obligations. The Inheritance Codex details a hierarchy where the most recently deceased hold the highest authority, followed by earlier generations in reverse chronological order. The living occupy the lowest position in this spiritual hierarchy, their value measured entirely by their usefulness to their deceased relatives. Each family member, from birth, was assigned specific duties toward their dead ancestors. These obligations were not symbolic but practical, requiring daily activities designed to maintain the deceased in their spiritual existence. Children were taught the names, preferences, and detailed requirements of ancestors dating back 6 generations. Their education focused not on preparing them for independent adult lives, but on developing the skills necessary to serve the increasingly complex needs of their growing population of deceased relatives. The system created a mathematical problem that would eventually prove unsolvable. As the number of deceased family members expanded with each generation, while the population of living relatives remained limited by the family's isolation, the burden of service became increasingly overwhelming. By the early 1900s, the 17 surviving Brackens were responsible for maintaining the spiritual welfare of over 200 deceased relatives, each with specific needs that had been carefully documented and passed down through generations of dutiful service. The Codex reveals that the family had developed elaborate rituals for communicating with their deceased relatives, receiving instructions about their care, and demonstrating proper devotion. These ceremonies required significant time and resources, gradually overwhelming the capacity of the living family members to maintain any activities beyond their spiritual obligations. Social withdrawal became necessary simply to accommodate the time demands of their ancestral duties. More troubling was the family's belief that inadequate service to the dead would result in terrible consequences for the living. The Codex describes a system of spiritual punishment where deceased family members could inflict suffering on their living relatives if their needs were not properly met. This created a climate of constant anxiety where any misfortune, illness, accident, or failure was interpreted as evidence of insufficient devotion to ancestral duty. The document also reveals the family's growing awareness that their system of perpetual servitude was mathematically unsustainable. The ratio of dead to living was increasing exponentially, while the demands of each spiritual relationship were becoming more complex. Simple arithmetic demonstrated that the burden would eventually exceed the capacity of any number of living relatives to fulfill adequately. The family considered various solutions to this dilemma. They explored the possibility of recruiting non-family members to assist with their spiritual obligations, but concluded that the necessary sensitivity could only be found in blood relatives. They investigated methods for simplifying the requirements of deceased ancestors, but determined that reducing their level of service would constitute a betrayal of their fundamental obligations. Their ultimate solution was as elegant as it was horrifying. If the living could not adequately serve the dead while maintaining their mortal existence, then they must join the dead while continuing their service in spiritual form. The final entries in the Codex describe their plan for the Great Convergence, a ritual designed to transform all living family members into deceased ones, thereby resolving the mathematical impossibility of their servitude system while ensuring that their ancestral obligations could continue indefinitely. This solution appealed to the family on multiple levels. It would eliminate the burden of physical existence that interfered with spiritual service. It would ensure that no ancestor would lack adequate attention from devoted relatives. Most importantly, it would demonstrate the ultimate commitment to their philosophical principles, a willingness to sacrifice individual existence for the continuation of familial duty. The doctrine of perpetual servitude had created a family trapped by their own devotion, bound by obligations that could only be fulfilled through their own destruction. Their systematic isolation had been necessary to maintain the purity of their spiritual practices, but it had also eliminated any external perspectives that might have challenged their increasingly extreme interpretations of family duty. By 1924, the surviving Brackens faced a choice between abandoning the philosophical system that had defined their family for generations, or implementing a solution that would honor their principles while resolving the practical impossibilities they had created. Their commitment to perpetual servitude made that choice inevitable. To understand how they implemented their final solution, we must examine the elaborate preparations they undertook during their last months of mortal existence. The final months of the Bracken family's existence were characterized by methodical preparation and systematic implementation of what they had come to view as their ultimate obligation. Through family correspondence, ritual implements discovered within the house, and the limited testimony of witnesses who observed their final activities, we can reconstruct the elaborate ceremony they called the Great Convergence, a collective death designed to transform their understanding of family service from burden into eternal fulfillment. Preparation began in earnest during the spring of 1924 when letters were dispatched to Bracken relatives who had settled in distant cities. These communications, carefully worded to avoid explicit mention of the ritual's true purpose, emphasized the critical importance of family unity and the approaching completion of ancestral obligations that had defined the Bracken lineage for generations. The correspondence reveals the family's sophisticated understanding of persuasion and psychological manipulation. Rather than demanding immediate compliance, the letters described the planned gathering as the culmination of spiritual developments that had been building for decades. Recipients were told that their participation would complete a sacred process that would benefit not only the living family members but all deceased Brackens who awaited resolution of their earthly obligations. As relatives arrived throughout May and early June, the house took on the atmosphere of both reunion and intensive spiritual retreat. Daily routines were restructured around what the family called purification practices, extended periods of fasting, meditation, and communion with the ancestral council. These sessions were conducted in the basement chambers where family members would spend hours in darkened rooms, reportedly receiving detailed instructions about their roles in the approaching ceremony. Dr. Cornelius Bracken, the family's most educated member and a trained physician, had spent years developing what he termed the sacred preparation, a botanical mixture designed to facilitate peaceful transition from life to death while preserving the consciousness necessary for continued spiritual service. His private journals detail extensive experimentation with various combinations of plant-based compounds, seeking a formula that would produce death without pain while maintaining what he believed to be the soul's connection to physical reality. The preparation of this mixture became a family ritual in itself. Various members were assigned to cultivate specific plants in carefully tended garden plots that had been blessed according to ancient family traditions. The harvesting, drying, and combination of these botanical elements followed elaborate protocols that had been developed through months of careful planning and spiritual consultation with deceased relatives. Concurrent with these chemical preparations, the family undertook the physical transformation of their house into what they considered appropriate space for their final ceremony. Every room was cleansed according to purification rituals that involved burning specially prepared incense, arranging flowers and candles in patterns that held spiritual significance, and positioning portraits of deceased family members to oversee the proceedings. The basement chambers were converted into what the family called departure stations, spaces designed to provide comfort and dignity during the transition from life to death. Each chamber was furnished with bedding that had been blessed in family ceremonies, personal items that would accompany individuals through their final moments, and ritual implements necessary for maintaining spiritual connection during the dying process. The family's children were prepared through intensive educational sessions that framed their participation as the highest honor available to members of their generation. Rather than experiencing fear or resistance, the children were taught to view their inclusion in the ceremony as evidence of their spiritual maturity and their valuable contribution to the family's eternal purposes. On the evening of June 21, 1924, chosen for its significance as the summer solstice and the traditional time of spiritual transformation, the family gathered for their final meal together. This ceremony followed strict protocols that had been developed through months of planning and spiritual consultation. Each course carried symbolic significance related to their transition from physical to spiritual existence. Prayers were offered for different aspects of their impending transformation, with particular attention to maintaining family unity through the dying process. The meal concluded with the ceremonial consumption of Dr. Cornelius Bracken's sacred preparation. The mixture was administered in carefully calculated doses that accounted for each person's age, physical condition, and designated role in the spiritual hierarchy they expected to maintain after death. The distribution followed precise protocols designed to ensure that no one would experience the dying process alone or without proper spiritual guidance. What followed was a coordinated death that unfolded over several hours, with family members transitioning in an order that reflected their positions within the family's spiritual hierarchy. The youngest members went first, under the care and guidance of adults who would follow in predetermined sequence. This arrangement ensured that no one would face death without the comfort of family presence, while maintaining the ceremonial dignity that the ritual required. The final phase involved the positioning of the bodies according to elaborate instructions that had been preserved in the family's ritual documents. Each person was arranged to face specific directions that corresponded to their role in the family's spiritual structure. Personal items were placed according to their significance in maintaining connection between the deceased and their ongoing obligations to the family's ancestral network. By dawn on June 22, the Great Convergence was complete. 17 members of the Bracken family had successfully transitioned from what they viewed as the burden of physical existence to the honor of eternal spiritual service. Their family tree had ended under one roof, but their understanding of family continuity suggested that ending was actually a beginning, the commencement of a form of service that would never require the compromises and limitations imposed by mortal existence. The ritual's completion left behind physical evidence of careful planning and spiritual conviction, but it also created questions about the community's role in facilitating, or at least permitting, such an elaborate collective suicide. The discovery of 17 bodies arranged in ceremonial positions throughout the Bracken estate created a crisis that extended far beyond the bounds of normal law enforcement. The scene that greeted Sheriff William Carver on June 24, 1924, when he responded to concerns about the family's absence, challenged both legal protocols and community stability in ways that would require unprecedented cooperation to manage effectively. Sheriff Carver's initial report, filed with the state police, documented what he termed an apparent ritual suicide involving multiple generations of a prominent local family. The report described the careful positioning of the bodies, the elaborate ceremonial elements, and the clear evidence of systematic preparation. Yet this document was quickly suppressed, and subsequent official records make no mention of the Bracken family's fate or the circumstances of their deaths. This suppression was not the result of incompetent investigation or bureaucratic oversight. Instead, it represented the activation of a carefully constructed network of obligations that the Bracken family had spent years establishing throughout their community. Investigation into their financial records reveals a systematic pattern of loans, investments, and contractual arrangements that created legal and economic incentives for discretion regarding family affairs. Key local officials found themselves bound by agreements that made disclosure of the Bracken deaths financially catastrophic. Sheriff Carver had received substantial loans from the family that came with specific conditions about confidentiality in matters involving family privacy. County Coroner Dr. Edmund Hayes faced similar constraints, as did Town Clerk Harrison Webb and Bank President Samuel Morrison. These agreements, legally binding and professionally enforced, effectively purchased the silence of those who would normally have been responsible for investigating and reporting the deaths. Dr. Hayes faced a particularly complex situation. His medical examination confirmed that all 17 deaths resulted from deliberate poisoning, implemented according to a careful plan that minimized suffering while ensuring simultaneous death across multiple age groups. The toxicological evidence was unambiguous. This was mass suicide, not natural death or accidental poisoning. Yet his official death certificates listed various natural causes, from heart failure to respiratory complications, making no mention of suicide, poison, or ritual circumstances. Hayes's private papers, discovered after his own death in 1947, revealed the enormous psychological toll of participating in this deception. His personal journals document recurring nightmares, persistent anxiety, and a growing conviction that the Bracken family's final ritual had somehow achieved its intended purpose. He wrote extensively about sensing the presence of deceased family members and receiving what he interpreted as expressions of gratitude for his cooperation in maintaining their secrets. The cover-up extended beyond legal and medical authorities to religious institutions. Reverend Timothy Ashworth of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, where the Brackens had maintained membership for generations, received detailed instructions about how their deaths should be handled. These instructions, accompanied by substantial financial donations to the church, required that the deaths be treated as natural occurrences and that no public services be conducted. The bodies were buried in the family plot without ceremony or publicity, their graves marked only with simple stones bearing names and dates, but no reference to the circumstances of their deaths. Church records were altered to remove any documentation that might raise questions about the family's final months or the nature of their deaths. Perhaps most disturbing was the extent to which ordinary community members participated in maintaining the conspiracy. The Bracken family had systematically created obligations throughout the region, business partnerships that required confidentiality, personal debts that could be called in if privacy was violated, and employment arrangements that made disclosure a breach of contract. Farmers who had sold produce to the family, craftsmen who had worked on their property, and neighbors who had witnessed their final preparations all found themselves bound by agreements that made truth-telling legally and financially ruinous. The family had effectively purchased not just silence but active participation in creating false narratives about their disappearance and death. The psychological impact on these reluctant conspirators proved severe and lasting. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, whose farm bordered the Bracken property, began experiencing what she described as visitations within weeks of the family's death. These episodes involved dreams so vivid that she could not distinguish them from waking experiences, in which deceased Bracken family members would appear to express gratitude for her discretion and remind her of her continuing obligations to protect their memory. Similar experiences were reported throughout the community by individuals who had been involved in the cover-up. The pattern was consistent: dreams or visions featuring deceased Brackens, expressions of appreciation for maintaining silence, and subtle reminders of the consequences that would follow disclosure. Whether these experiences represented psychological guilt, supernatural contact, or community pressure designed to reinforce compliance, their effect was to strengthen rather than weaken the conspiracy of silence. Those who attempted to speak about the Bracken deaths reported experiencing misfortunes that seemed too coincidental to be natural. Crop failures affected farmers who had considered discussing their observations. Unexplained illnesses struck family members of potential witnesses. Business difficulties arose for merchants who had contemplated revealing their knowledge of the family's final preparations. These problems consistently ceased when individuals renewed their commitment to maintaining silence about the Bracken case. The success of this elaborate cover-up created a community-wide complicity that transformed ordinary citizens into active participants in the Bracken family's final ritual. The conspiracy of silence did not merely conceal the truth about their deaths, it fulfilled the family's intention that their sacrifice would be protected and honored by those they left behind. This protection would prove to extend far beyond the immediate aftermath of their deaths, creating ongoing obligations that would bind not just the original witnesses, but their descendants, and eventually anyone who encountered the Bracken story. The Bracken legacy extends beyond historical documentation into the realm of ongoing experience, manifesting in ways that suggest their final ritual achieved purposes that transcend conventional understanding of death and memory. Since Margaret Holloway's initial investigation, researchers, local residents, and visitors to the abandoned estate have reported phenomena that challenge our assumptions about the relationship between past events and present reality. Dr. Holloway herself was the first to document what would become known as the Bracken effect. Within months of filing her census report, she began experiencing recurring dreams, featuring deceased family members expressing gratitude for her work in preserving their story. These dreams were notable for their consistency and historical accuracy, containing details about family history that proved correct when verified against records she had never accessed. More concerning was Holloway's gradual adoption of behavioral patterns that mirrored those of the Bracken family during their final years. She began withdrawing from social activities, dedicating increasing amounts of time to genealogical research, and expressing growing anxiety about her obligations to deceased relatives. Her own family noted that she had begun referring to her continued investigation as the service, viewing her research not as professional duty, but as sacred obligation. This pattern has been replicated by subsequent researchers who have studied the Bracken case. Dr. Helena Morrison, the genealogist who analyzed the family's breeding records, reported similar experiences of compelling dreams and an evolving sense of personal mission that gradually superseded her academic interests. Her research notes document a transformation from scholarly curiosity to spiritual commitment, with later entries describing her work as maintaining the remembrance and expressing concern about the consequences that would follow if the Bracken story were forgotten. Local residents near the estate continue to report phenomena that suggest the property remains active in ways that conventional understanding cannot explain. The house, though officially vacant since 1924, periodically shows signs of habitation that appear and disappear without apparent cause. Windows that have been boarded over for decades are sometimes observed to emit light during nighttime hours. Sounds of conversation and domestic activity have been documented by multiple witnesses, invariably ceasing immediately when investigated. More significantly, individuals who spend extended time near the property report experiencing what they describe as the calling, a compelling urge to enter the house and participate in activities that echo the family's final preparations. These experiences include vivid dreams about family obligations, sudden interest in genealogical research, and growing conviction that specific duties must be fulfilled to honor the dead. Several individuals have required physical intervention to prevent them from entering the house, claiming they had received explicit instructions from deceased family members about tasks they needed to complete. These episodes typically involve people with no previous knowledge of the Bracken case who developed sudden obsessions with the family after minimal exposure to their story. The phenomenon extends beyond physical proximity to the estate. Letters preserved in the Millbrook Historical Society archives include numerous accounts from individuals who became intensely focused on the Bracken case after reading brief references to their disappearance or viewing photographs of the abandoned property. These correspondents describe experiences ranging from dreams about the family to compelling urges to visit the estate or continue research into their background. Perhaps most troubling are reports from descendants of those who participated in the original cover-up. Children and grandchildren of local officials who suppressed the investigation have reported inherited dreams and behavioral patterns that suggest the family's influence operates across generational boundaries. These individuals often have no conscious knowledge of their ancestors' involvement with the Brackens, yet they display the same patterns of obsessive interest in the family's story and the same sense of obligation to maintain their secrets. The cumulative effect of these phenomena suggests that the Bracken family's final ritual created a form of existence that depends on the attention and service of others. Their systematic elimination of their bloodline appears to have established a mechanism for drawing unrelated individuals into their system of spiritual servitude, extending their influence through the very act of remembrance and investigation. Modern researchers studying the case face a disturbing possibility that by documenting the Bracken story, preserving their memory, and attempting to understand their motivations, we may be providing exactly the service and attention that their spiritual system requires for continuation. Each investigation, each attempt at historical analysis, each effort to comprehend their fate may constitute participation in the perpetual servitude they sought to establish through their final sacrifice. The family's influence appears to operate through the process of engagement itself, transforming curiosity into obligation and academic interest into spiritual commitment. The more thoroughly one studies the Bracken case, the more compelling their story becomes, and the more necessary continued investigation appears. This pattern suggests that their final ritual was designed not merely to resolve their own spiritual obligations, but to create a mechanism for recruiting others into their or system of eternal service. The implications are deeply unsettling. If the Bracken family's final ritual succeeded in creating a form of existence that perpetuates itself through the attention of researchers and investigators, then every attempt to understand their story becomes an act of participation in their ongoing spiritual practices. The dead may have found a way to continue receiving the service they required, not from blood relatives, but from anyone curious enough to investigate their fate. This possibility transforms our understanding of the Bracken case from historical investigation to active spiritual engagement, suggesting that the family's influence extends through time and space to touch anyone who encounters their story with sufficient depth and attention to become valuable to their purposes. As our investigation into the Bracken family draws toward its conclusion, we must confront the fundamental limitations of our understanding and acknowledge the deliberate gaps in the historical record that may never, and perhaps should never, be filled. Some aspects of their story resist conventional investigation, existing in the spaces between documented fact and inexplicable experience, reminding us that certain truths carry prices that extend far beyond the moment of discovery. The Brackens themselves contributed significantly to these gaps through their systematic destruction of evidence during the months preceding their final ritual. Family records document elaborate ceremonies for burning documents, destroying photographs, and eliminating traces of their activities that they deemed unnecessary for the remembrance. What survived was carefully curated to preserve only those elements of their story that they wanted future generations to discover and understand. This selective preservation creates a narrative that feels simultaneously comprehensive and frustratingly incomplete. We understood, and the broad structure of their doctrine, the mechanics of their final ritual, and the methods they use to ensure community compliance with their wishes. Yet crucial details remain hidden. The specific content of their alleged communications with deceased relatives, the exact nature of their spiritual experiences, and the full implications of their belief system for understanding family obligation and ancestral duty. The ethical dimensions of investigating the Bracken case have grown increasingly complex as our research has progressed. The family expended extraordinary effort to ensure that their story would be preserved while maintaining control over how it was remembered and interpreted. Our investigation may be fulfilling their intentions in ways we cannot fully comprehend, making us participants in their ongoing existence rather than objective historians documenting past events. The experiences reported by previous researchers suggest that the act of studying the Brackens creates a relationship with them that transcends academic interest and enters the realm of personal obligation. The recurring dreams, behavioral modifications, and sense of compulsive duty documented by those who have investigated their case indicate that their influence operates through the very process of remembrance and research. By seeking to understand them, we may be providing precisely the service and attention that their spiritual system requires for continuation. This possibility raises profound questions about the nature of historical investigation and the responsibilities of researchers when dealing with subjects who may have designed their stories to perpetuate their influence beyond death. If studying the Brackens draws investigators into their system of spiritual obligation, then objective analysis becomes impossible, and every attempt to understand their motivations becomes an action of service to their ongoing existence. The broader implications extend to our understanding of family dysfunction, inherited trauma, and the mechanisms through which pathological patterns can perpetuate themselves across generations and even across family boundaries. The Bracken case suggests that certain forms of systematic dysfunction may be capable of creating self-perpetuating cycles that transcend individual lifetimes and biological relationships. Perhaps most troubling is the recognition that the Bracken influence appears to be expanding rather than diminishing over time. Each new investigator, each additional researcher, and each person who encounters their story with sufficient depth becomes potentially connected to their ongoing existence. The family's final ritual may have achieved not only the resolution of their immediate spiritual obligations, but the creation of a mechanism for drawing others into their system of perpetual service. The incomplete nature of our understanding may itself be part of their design. By leaving crucial questions unanswered and essential details hidden, the Brackens ensure that their story continues to compel investigation, research, and remembrance. The gaps in the record create a need for continued study that may be indistinguishable from the spiritual service their doctrine required of family members. We cannot definitively determine whether the phenomena reported by those who study the Bracken case represent psychological responses to encountering extreme family dysfunction, the influence of suggestion and expectation, or something that transcends conventional understanding of consciousness and identity. What we can observe is a consistent pattern of behavioral change among researchers that mirrors the very obligations and compulsions that drove the family to their final desperate act. The mathematical problem that confronted the Brackens, an ever-expanding populate, when of deceased relatives requiring service from a finite number of living family members, may have been resolved through their final ritual in a way that extends their influence beyond the boundaries of blood relationship. If their system of perpetual servitude now operates through the mechanism of historical investigation and academic research, then they have successfully transformed their private family obligation into a public legacy that continues to grow with each new person who encounters their story. As we conclude this investigation, we must acknowledge that we may never fully understand what transpired within the walls of the Bracken estate during those final months, or what continues to transpire through our attempts to remember and document their story. Some secrets may be designed to remain secret, not because they cannot be discovered, but because the act of discovery transforms the discoverer in ways that serve purposes beyond our comprehension. The Bracken family tree ended under one roof in 1924, but their story continues through every attempt to understand that ending. In seeking to illuminate their mystery, we may have become part of it, bound to carry their memory forward and ensure that their sacrifice serves its intended purpose. Whether this represents historical investigation or spiritual service remains a question that each person who encounters their story must answer individually, knowing that the very act of consideration may constitute the service they sought to ensure would never end. The record remains unfinished because some stories are designed never to be completed, existing instead as warnings, obligations, and reminders that certain forms of knowledge come with costs that extend far beyond the moment of acquisition. In the case of the Brackens, that cost may be the transformation of every reader, every researcher, and every investigate, tore into a participant in a family story that was never intended to conclude with death. The 17 signatures on that final document. The arrangement is complete. The debt is paid. Let no one disturb what has been willingly given. May have been premature. The arrangement may still be unfolding. The debt may still be accumulating interest, and what was willingly given may continue to exact its price from those who seek to understand the gift and its giver. In the end, we are left with questions that resist resolution and a story that refuses to remain safely in the past. The Bracken family's final ritual may have been more successful than they could have imagined, creating not an ending but a beginning, the commencement of a form of spiritual service that extends through time and space to touch anyone who encounters their legacy with sufficient attention to become useful to their eternal purposes. Whether you close this investigation feeling satisfied with historical understanding or compelled toward further research may itself be an indication of how successfully the Brackens have extended their influence beyond the boundaries of their mortal existence. The choice of how to respond to their story, with academic detachment or personal engagement with closure or continued investigation, may be less free than we imagine. The Bracken estate stands empty still, its windows dark, its rooms silent. But emptiness and silence may be precisely the conditions necessary for the family's continued existence, and their story continues to unfold in the minds and dreams of those who seek to understand what it means to carry obligations that transcend death itself.